American popular song, when did it reach the point of no return? And I'm going to say that it came at a particular spring afternoon in 1954. Afternoon much like today, as a matter of fact, I think it was. And it took place in an office in New York City, and the office belonged to Mitch Miller. Yeah, the meeting was with that man right there. That man was named Arthur Schwartz. He was born with a century, so he was 53 years old, not yet 54, in 1954. And he was a notable composer, not quite on the level of the Gershwins, the Richard Rodgers, the Cole Porters, but almost. He had written standards like Dancing in the Dark, You and the Night and the Music, I Guess I'll Have to Change My Plan, and many others. And he was a friend of all those great songwriters. Right now, he was working with this woman, Dorothy Field, who is actually the only woman in that otherwise all-male club of popular songwriters. And they had a musical about to go up on Broadway. The musical was called By the Beautiful Sea. Now, has anyone heard of that? Seen it? Yeah, I know Jane has, but right, that's kind of the point. Arthur Schwartz's glory days, those songs that I just mentioned, were long past. They had been written in the 20s and into the 30s, and things just weren't happening. Schwartz was very proud of his position. He was, like most of the other composers, a Jewish New Yorker, but he sometimes seemed to try to hide that fact. He was also an attorney. His son, Jonathan Schwartz, the well-known disc jockey, later wrote of his father, Arthur, that he cut a suave path. He was cultivated, as suggested by his unaccountable, ever so slight British accent. He was always wonderfully dressed. He moved gracefully with cigarette in hand, a man in honorable thought. Well, that was all well and good, but for some years now, things just hadn't happened for him. He had some shows on Broadway, but they didn't run very long. Another one was called Park Avenue, a short-lived show. His songs weren't being recorded, and of course, as a result, weren't played on the radio. And that was the reason for his meeting this day with Mitch Miller. Now, Mitch Miller might not be known to some of you, and those of you to whom he is known probably know him for something else, but at the time he was the most powerful man in American popular music. He had actually started out as a classical oboist and was a notable oboist, but about 5 years earlier in '48, he had been lured to a record company position by his good friend John Hammond. And almost immediately he had produced a hit. That hit was Mule Train by Frankie Laine. Now, produced is the key word here. The notion that we have today of record producers didn't exist back then. Back then, the position, Mitch Miller's official position, was A&R man, artist and repertory man. And what an A&R man did was essentially sign the talent, contract for the songs, get some session musicians in there, and an engineer would turn the dials. Well, Mitch Miller revolutionized that business. On Mule Train, his first hit, he simulated the sound of a cracking whip by putting two blocks together. He put in odd instrumentation like harpsichords. He had overdubbing. On a song called Cry of the Wild Goose, he simulated the sound of the cry of wild geese, in fact, with French horns. So for him, a record revolutionarily was a production. He was the person who emblematized the change from a song-oriented popular music to a record-oriented popular music. And that was why, and you could look at the next slide now, every week he would open his door on Tuesdays, and the song pluggers, publishers, songwriters would parade in and play their wares for Mitch Miller. He had the famously sensitive ears. And you can see the next one inside his office. But here's the thing about Mitch Miller, the thing that made some of his artists like Rosemary Clooney and Tony Bennett a bit uncomfortable. There was a widespread sense that as successful as Mitch Miller was, and by the way, his nickname was the Beard because of his trademark goatee, he was called the Golden Boy in an article in Vogue about the music business. As successful as he was, he didn't seem to really like popular music. He didn't appreciate the great songs. He didn't have a sense of the jazz music that all these great songs had really come from. To him, a song, as much as the special effects, the instrumentation, was a commodity. Anything that he could do to make the customer part with his dollar for record, he would do. To him, it was whispered and sometimes said out loud that the only real music was classical music. Everything else was just a product. And so as a result, some of the hits that Mitch Miller produced at Columbia, they weren't really on the level of You and the Night and the Music or Someone to Watch Over Me. They were songs like Rosemary Clooney's ethnically puzzling Mambo Italiano, and the Armenian pastiche Come On to My House, both huge hits. Guy Mitchell had a song that not sure what the ethnicity was supposed to be. Feet Up, Pat Him on the Popo, big hit. Tony Bennett's Cold, Cold Heart, which when you looked at it was an odd combination. It was a song by an Alabama honky-tonker named Hank Williams, belted out by an Italian-American from Astoria, Queens. Also a huge hit. And another big hit, 12-year-old Jimmy Boyd's I Saw Mama Kissing Santa Claus, right? Fans of Jimmy Boyd are in the house, wow. So a year after his meeting with Schwartz, and Elizabeth, you can put up the next slide, Mitch Miller had the idea of gathering together an all-male chorus, resurrecting a 100 or more year old song, and recording it, getting up in that garb for the sheet music cover, The Yellow Rose of Texas. And of course that improbably shot to #1, stayed there for 5 weeks, and led to the enterprise for which Mitch Miller is best known today, his string of albums, Sing Along with Mitch, TV series, Sing Along with Mitch. I think there were cocktail napkins and coasters, Sing Along with Mitch as well. So that was what he was known for. So here he was, this record producer, this money man, meeting with Arthur Schwartz, the cultivated English accented guy. So beneath the surface, Mitch Miller was a controversial person in popular music. And the person that he would most clash with was Columbia's biggest name artist, Frank Sinatra. Indeed. Now, Sinatra was the biggest name artist Columbia had, but he was not the biggest selling, not by a long shot. And in fact, in the early 50s, Sinatra's career had hit bottom. It was a far cry from the Bobby Soxer days of just 10 years earlier at the Paramount Theater. Basically nothing he put out met with success in the public. Also, his personal life with Ava Gardner was not going too well. His movies, nothing was really happening for Sinatra. Mitch Miller would try to come up with one piece of material after the other for Sinatra to regain his standing with. None of them worked. I mean, he had a hit. His biggest hit of the period was Goodnight Irene, and probably a folk song from Leadbelly. He had country tunes, and can you imagine Sinatra singing country? Like the Hucklebuck and Chattanooga Shoeshine Boy, and novelty numbers like Bim Bam Baby and Mama Will Bark, which was a duet with a television personality named Dagmar, backed by barking dogs. Now, does anyone remember Dagmar? Yeah, right, okay, well that's the point. This was what was happening with Sinatra. Now, the next year, and you know, sometimes when you read Sinatra biographies, they'll say that he left Columbia. Well, he left because they dropped him. They fired him. They kicked him out. And fortunately for us and for him, his career turned around. The next year, he had an engagement at the Copa nightclub in New York. And according to one account, he snapped a bullwhip and honked derisively like a wild goose. No one had to explain what or who he was referring to. And in fact, for the rest of his life, Sinatra would continually publicly assail Mitch Miller for forcing him to record Drek like Mama Will Bark. Mitch Miller would always counter that Sinatra's contract said he had final approval on all his material, and in fact, no one could force him to record anything. This went back and forth for decades until finally Sinatra died in 1998, and Mitch Miller had the last word. He stayed around for 12 more years until he finally passed away in 2010 at the age of 99. But back in 1954, as Arthur Schwartz walked into Mitch Miller's office, the atmosphere was a little bit awkward. And it wasn't only because of this tectonic clash of sensibilities. There was also the somewhat uncomfortable fact that just 1 year earlier, Arthur Schwartz had sued Mitch Miller's employer, Columbia Records, for $150 million. That law degree had finally come in handy. Now, he wasn't the only plaintiff. In fact, and if you look at the next slide, there were 34 plaintiffs in this lawsuit. You recognize some of the folks there. Oscar Hammerstein is there. He was not one, but Richard Adler, Bob Merrill, Steve Allen, Dorothy Field again, Otto Harbach on the right, who was one of the original founders of ASCAP in 1914. They had sued Columbia, the other major record labels, the radio networks, and a performing rights organization called BMI, Broadcast Music Inc., which was the rival to the one they all belonged to, ASCAP, for $150 million, charging them all with conspiracy to keep their songs off the air and off of records. And that was hogwash. There was no conspiracy, but there was no other answer they could find about what had happened to their music, which had disappeared. Now, if we look back on it now and we ask the question, what killed the great American songbook, we might say rock and roll. But in fact, in 1954, Elvis Presley still had not cut his first record with Sun Records, and the phrase rock and roll itself would have elicited a blank look on the face of almost all Americans. Well, almost all white Americans, that is. So Schwartz and his fellow lords of Tin Pan Alley decided there was a conspiracy. In 1954, the lawsuit was just getting underway with deposition and motions as Schwartz went into Miller's office, and he sat down to the piano and he played the score of By the Beautiful Sea. There was a moment of silence. Mitch Miller said that one of the songs was a possibility, but only one, and that was a ballad called More Love Than Your Love. Does anyone know that song? Yeah, right, so that's the point. But even that one needed work, he said. Schwartz remembered Miller saying, I think you ought to make a change in the melody. I don't like the second 8 measures. I think maybe you should repeat the first 8 measures where you now have a new 8-measure section. Schwartz replied, thank you for the suggestion. I will think it over. Those quotes come from Schwartz's testimony before a congressional committee that, with the lawsuit seemingly stalled, was the songwriter's next venue for looking into the so-called conspiracy. And you can imagine the iciness of that thank you. This goateed vulgarian, whose claim to fame was insinuating the sound of a whip into Mule Train, who had been responsible for Come On to My House and Mama Will Bark, telling him, Arthur Schwartz, a colleague and friend of George Gershwin, that he thought he should put a song into AABA form, which was the elemental form of all songs since the days of Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern. as if this were some sort of brilliant and original insight. Well, the Congressional Committee, of course, found there was no conspiracy, and as did a federal judge when he threw out the lawsuit with prejudice in 1971, 18 years after it had been filed. There was no conspiracy, just a fundamental change, a point of no return in American popular music, one that we're still experiencing. Back in the 50s, testifying before that committee, Arthur Schwartz recounted the aftermath of his meeting with Miller. Looked at in the light of the massive transformation just starting to take place, his words take on added resonance. Here's what he said. I thought it over, and I decided I would not make the change. Thank you very much.